Now, to close the conference, I'm pleased to welcome on stage our best-known living philosopher.
I'm still living.
A.C. Grayling. He's written extensively on religion, Darwinism, contemporary dance, the romantic critic William Hazlitt, the morality of bombing civilians in World War II, and the Age of Enlightenment. And he's been very outspoken on Brexit as well. When I say outspoken, I have a quote here. Last month he wrote, "The UK is being stolen. It's being stolen by a cabal which is using the outcome of a flawed, gerrymandered, politically illegitimate referendum to hustle the UK out of the European Union." I wonder if you'd have something to say to us about that.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm taking a leaf out of George W. Bush's book, and I'm going to stand behind a lectern in case one of you throws a shoe. So the question that I've been asked to address, have we lost reason? When I originally read the question, I thought it said, have we lost our reason, which is slightly more to the point. And if you look across the last 9 months, 12 months or so, it would seem that we have. But actually, it's not that anything has changed. There isn't a difference of kind in our public debate, our public thought, in the way that human beings, our fellows in the great human story, approach matters of choice, of decision, of public life or of private life. What has changed, however, is the way these things are managed and manipulated. You will remember that Demosthenes, the great orator of ancient times, became an orator because of the experience he had as a young man attending philosophy lectures. This is a rather dispiriting story from the point of view of somebody whose day job is teaching philosophy, because what happened was Demosthenes was sitting with a small group of people listening to a lecture given by a philosopher, and he noticed in another part of the agora a very large group of people hanging on every word of somebody who was lecturing inaudibly because of the distance. And he said, "Who's that?" And he was told that that person was an orator, somebody with rhetorical skills, who was able to persuade and manipulate, change opinion, sway people from one side of an argument to another. And he thought, that's what I'm going to do. And so he left his philosophy class and he went off and he became an orator, became somebody skilled, in other words, at persuasion. Now, some of you here might remember back in the palmy year of 1952 when Adlai Stevenson was standing as the Democratic nominee against Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, in the presidential campaign of that year. And somebody went up to Stevenson and said to him, "Mr. Stevenson, every thinking person in the United States of America is going to vote for you." And he said, "I'm delighted to hear it, but I need a majority." And this absolutely encapsulates the problem that we are faced with, and that Demosthenes, of course, realized when he saw that manipulation or influence upon or persuasion of opinion is not a matter of reason, except for the rather few, a minority demographic. That mainly the way people are persuaded to do things, choices they make, the things they buy, how they vote, is a matter of their attitudes, of their sentiments. Now, everybody knows what Churchill said about democracy, that it's the least bad of a lot of bad systems, and not many people know about the second thing he said about democracy, actually following Plato in this. He said the strongest argument against democracy is 2 minutes conversation with any voter, because this illustrates how lack of information, short-termism, self-interest, prejudice, ignorance, and so on, factor into the sorts of decisions that people make about things. And that the very smart orator, the smart follower of Demosthenes, is going to identify and then make use of those features of the non-rational approach that people have to their decision-making. I will guess that all of you were reading Daniel Kahneman in the bath last night, Thinking Fast and Slow, so you will know the distinction that he draws between the fast thinkers, by which he doesn't mean people who are extremely smart and therefore come to decisions very quickly. He means by the phrase people who don't really think. They don't, when they're offered something, an idea, a claim, a theory, they don't examine it. They don't look for the evidence. They don't look for the supporting information that would bolster that claim. Instead, they respond with an emotional and sometimes even a prejudicial reflex. And that it's that determines what they do. The slow thinkers are the people, Kahneman says, who will look for the evidence, examine the arguments, explore what it is that lies behind a putative claim, and make a judgment about it themselves. And the slow thinkers, as Adlai Stevenson pointed out, are in the minority. So have we lost reason? Well, in a sense, we never had it. In the sense that majorities, the people who have made up the great bulk of public opinion or who have voted, have been people who have been doing it not on the basis of rational considerations, but on the basis of non-rational considerations. Now, I don't mean for a moment to disparage that fact. After all, non-rational considerations are not necessarily irrational ones. Irrationality is just a subspecies, if you like, of non-rationality. Our emotional lives are, by definition, non-rational because emotion and reason are very contrasted to one another. But it is a very interesting fact about the way that reason and emotion can work together and how emotion can be brought into play to bring about these effects, such as we've seen recently in the Trump election and in the EU referendum. So, for example, the psychologist Antonio Damasio has pointed out that if there were really a Mr. Spock from Star Trek, remember he was the chap with the pointy ears who allegedly was purely logical, had no emotional life at all. We know that's not true because secretly he was in love with Captain Kirk all the time. But allegedly he's just a pure logical machine. And Damasio points out about him that if there were such a character, he would be a very poor reasoner. He would be very bad at making decisions. And this is because when we think and choose, when we make decisions, we need not just reason, but we need something that motivates us, something that guides or impels us. Remember David Hume, the great David Hume, president of this beautiful city, who pointed out that a purely logical individual, a purely logical being, would never be able to make important decisions, but would be in the position of Buridan's ass, the donkey, you may remember, who was stationed between two bales of hay. And since he had no more reason to eat the one on the left than the one on the right, he died of starvation. That would be the result of being far too rational about things. So emotional input into our decisions is important. But what kind of emotional input? Think of a small child. A small child, an infant, is an anarchist. And our task when we're parents is to try to coach and educate and direct and guide the formation of the emotional profile of the child. For example, to help the child govern its anger and its appetites, to foster its feelings of sympathy and affection for others. To educate emotions is to make them good partners to our reason. So somebody who is possessed of self-mastery when it comes to emotion and with a clear-sighted, mature attitude towards things in the world outside is going to be a mature individual, somebody we think of as a reasonable, reflective person who wants to be informed and who wants to base what he or she does on that information. Indeed, in classical antiquity, the outlook of the most educated and reflective people was Stoicism. And the Stoics had a very remarkable, simple, but very deep ethical outlook, which said, with respect to things that lie beyond our control, earthquakes and tsunamis and aging and disease, we must have courage. But with respect to things that we can control, our appetites, our fears, our desires, we must try to achieve some degree of self-mastery. And so with courage towards the outward and self-mastery towards the inward, we can live with nobility. That was the Stoic conception. And it's given rise, of course, to our use of the word Stoicism now, somebody who lives with a certain degree of fortitude, and it enables me to tell my students the following joke about the two old ladies overheard discussing on a Glasgow bus, one saying to the other, "My dear, You must be philosophical about this. Don't give it another thought. Well, of course, that comes from the Stoic tradition. It's not quite what I'm hoping my students are going to pick up from it. But it illustrates the fact that if you have educated emotions and they are annexed to the work of reason, you do get, as a result, the kind of person that Daniel Kahneman would describe as a slow thinker, a reflective person who wants to be informed so that he or she can arrive at good judgments about things. The fast thinker, the person whose intellect, whose reason, whose powers of rationality are not annexed to the feelings, the prejudices, the desires and appetites that they have, are therefore going to be very reliant on those things. They're therefore not going to have beliefs or opinions or theories. They're going to have attitudes. And if you were to take the example of the EU referendum, you will notice this, whatever your personal view is. You may out there be avid Trump supporters and enthusiastic leavers. I'm not going to try to persuade you, unless you ask me to, that it was a politically illegitimate event. But if you just look at the way that the two campaigns were run, people who voted Remain, on the whole, voted for something they were familiar with. So we've been part of the EU for 40 years, so people know what they're getting. They know it's a great imaginative project. It's got its problems and its flaws and so on, but they were desirous of remaining signed up to that project because of the advantages that they saw in it. The Leave demographic was very, very diverse. You've just been talking about diversity. Well, here were large numbers of different groupings of people who voted Leave for sets of reasons that weren't always consistent with the sets of reasons that other Leavers had. So a very diverse group of people. But this diversity was aggregated by using our contemporary version of the oratorical and rhetorical skills that Demosthenes so long ago was able to use. Skills that would persuade and aggregate opinion, aggregate the vote, so that even though there were lots of different constituencies, so to speak, in the overall constituency, nevertheless they could act together just enough to tip the scales. In fact, the easiest way to illustrate this is to ask you to remember an occasion during the presidential campaign last year in which Mr. Trump said, "I am Mr. Brexit." Do you remember that occasion? He said, "I am Mr. Brexit." And the reason why he said that was because his campaign were using the same company that was used by the Leave campaign in the United Kingdom, namely Cambridge Analytica. Speaking as an Oxford man, it gives me a certain pleasure that the company in question is called that, although it turns out it has nothing to do with the University of Cambridge. What Cambridge Analytica does, it's a big data company, as you know, and what it does is it's able to provide extremely precise profiles on the basis of the very, very large amounts of information it gleans from social media, blogs and Twitter and Facebook, and the kind of data that you might get, for example, looking at somebody's credit card usage. Very accurately, you can pinpoint what a person's age bracket is, where they might live, what their educational attainments are, how they're likely to think or feel about certain things in political matters and social matters, and so on. And they were able thereby, by trawling the massive amount of data, the hundreds of millions of data points out there in cyberspace, to identify a number of themes that exercised people who might be persuadable to vote for Mr. Trump. Now go back onto YouTube and have a look at a Trump speech. You will probably find on first listening to it that you think it incoherent and probably internally self-contradictory. But actually, it's quite cleverly organized. What it is, it's a necklace of targeted messages. So you would say one thing, which would resonate tremendously with one particular group of people, another thing, quite unconnected, resonating with yet another group, and so on, a necklace of different messages strung together and broadcast. People out there listening to the message will hear the message that really might mean something to them. They will hear that message and they will remember it. The other messages may not have such an effect on them, but will be having an effect on yet another group somewhere. And that is the way of aggregating opinion, aggregating the vote to support a particular view. That happened in the Leave campaign here too. You will know that there were certain hot-button issues like sovereignty, footnote, I can't resist saying sovereignty, I ask you. What a vague concept. You can imagine people out there on the manufacturing line saying, it's a sovereignty business. You know, I'm really enthusiastic about it. Sovereignty, immigration, take back control, let's make our own laws, etc., etc. These sorts of things that might speak to people. This person worried about immigration. By the way, lots of people who worry about immigration have never met an immigrant. It's a very characteristic thing that you either have had direct experience of losing your own job because you think there are too many immigrants in your community, or if you live in an all-white Wiltshire village and you've never seen an immigrant in your life, you're quite sure to be against the idea of immigration. You correlate, aggregate these people together and get them to feel the same thing about that issue, and you can get them on your side. And that's what happened. Just enough to tip the balance in the overall decision. Now, in the 2,500 years since Demosthenes, the practice of demagoguery, of persuasion, of manipulation, the practice of education, which after all is just the desirable and respectable version of trying to change people's minds or coach them to be a certain way or think a certain way, has been a perennial in our human and social affairs. So, as I say, there's nothing new about it. What is new, of course, is the speed and the power of the technologies that we have available to us now that enable us to do this. But the speed and the power of those technologies also helps us to think about ways in which we can counteract the malign effects and to try to promote the benign effects. And indeed, one of the great promises that contemporary technology, very closely allied to the use made of it in election campaigns and so on, is promising the possibility of extending education at all levels to parts of the world where there's very little infrastructure for education. I mean, think about being in a developing economy where higher education now becomes available to people if they have an iPad. You don't have to build a campus and a library and so on. Equip people with an iPad, and they can listen to lectures by marvelous professors from Harvard and Stanford and MIT on what's now called the MOOC phenomenon, the massive open online course phenomenon. And these technologies, therefore, have as much power for good as they do for less good, if we think of the kind of manipulation that we've just been talking about as something malign. So as a conduit for information and as a way of trying to persuade people to take the responsibility to think for themselves and to make a judgment on the basis of that information, it is a potentiator. But it will always have to overcome the contrast between the fast-thinking and the slow-thinking demographics identified by Kahneman, because of the natural propensity that people have to think with their feelings, to have attitudes about things rather than information about them. So have we lost reason? Well, as I said earlier, we've never really had it if we realize that it is emotion rather than reason that leads people to make the choices that they do. That therefore, the harnessing of reason to emotion, the education of the emotions so that people can want to be better judging and make better use of their reason, would have to be the target, the aim of education. And we all know that education is the great opportunity for change and for enhancing all the things, kinds of things that we value, things like tolerance and understanding and the rest in a society. But it is, as the French say, a work of long breath. It's very hard to educate large numbers of people into attitudes and ways of thinking if, as is always the case, there is this great drag anchor of personal interest, self-interest and short-termism that affects us because of our human nature, because of what we are like. The final point is this. When we think about reason and the use of reason, when we think about reasoning, reasoning powers, forms of reasoning, the kind of logic that underlies good, responsible, intellectually responsible reasoning, what we're talking about, of course, is rationality. If you reflect on that word, rationality, you will see that the first part of the word, ratio, means proportion. What it is to be rational is to be apt to proportion your beliefs or your actions to the evidence that supports either. Rationality is about looking to see how strongly a particular view is supported by the available evidence, or how probable it is that an action you're going to take on that evidence is going to have good outcomes. Non-rationality and its naughty cousin irrationality have the following characteristics. That non-rationality ignores altogether the question whether or not there is sufficient evidence in support or strength of argument in support. Instead, the non-rational approach to things flows from how one is responding to them, what one sees as a conformity between the thing thought about or believed and one's own desires and appetites. Irrationality, of course, is when you see that the evidence runs contrary to what you should be thinking or believing. Remember what Bertrand Russell said. Bertrand Russell said, it doesn't matter what you believe, it's the reasons why you believe it that make you a responsible thinker or an irresponsible one. If your reasons for thinking a certain way are very well tested, thoroughly examined, there's good evidence for it, or you've really looked for the evidence that can be adduced in favour, then you are being epistemologically responsible. But if you believe because you were told it by a neighbour, or it was written in a document 2,000 years ago, or because your community thinks that way, your parents did, that's not a responsible reason for thinking in that way, and therefore you should be challenged. The work of challenging is the work of education, not just a formal education, but social education. In the great conversation that a society has with itself about what matters and what is good, we should be always aiming for the rational, aiming to harness well-educated emotion to the kinds of judgments that a responsible mind is apt to make. So perhaps our question should be, can we reclaim reason in public life and in the decisions that we make? Can we hope that what we've learned from the Leave and Remain campaigns and from the presidential campaign last year and from the kinds of techniques that we used to give us a much flashier, chrome-plated version of Demosthenes, that is the big data analyses provided by Cambridge Analytica, can we learn from these to see if our decisions in our public life, in the public sphere, can be more rather than less rational? And the key point that we would remember as we do this is another thing that Bertrand Russell said. You may remember he said, most people would rather die than think, and most people do. And that, of course, is the tragedy of our world. Thank you.
I'm going to open straight up to questions from the floor. We have roughly 5 minutes or so. There's a gentleman in the middle here with a question. Thanks, Sarah.
You talked about challenging there, and I mean, as far as I could see in the referendum campaign, all the Remain side did was challenge. I wonder, by challenging, by when someone asserts something without any evidence, to address that, to challenge that, do you validify, do you give validity to that assertion? Because I'm trying to find a way that we can challenge this effectively. As I say, all the Remain side did in the referendum was challenge, with no success whatsoever.
I think the Remain campaign was very poorly conducted, largely, I think, because nobody believed that there could possibly be any other outcome than Remain, so it didn't exert itself enough. It wasn't imaginative enough. It made the very bad mistake of not talking about all the positives. It talked about the negatives that might happen and already happening to the economy. So I agree with you. But on the more general point about challenging, the task we set ourselves in the context of a debate where there's a difference of opinion or attitude and where cases have to be made and the cases have to be persuasive, is to identify what it is on the other side of the argument that needs to be targeted. If you find that what you're saying in favour of your side of the case simply doesn't register, doesn't matter to the person on the other side, they don't care about that. So if you said, for example, you're going to be 10% worse off in 5 years' time, and they don't care about that, or it doesn't impinge because they're very short-termist, they're interested in what's going to happen now, then you're making a mistake. You have to dig out, find the thing, the assumption on which their point of view rests. It happens, by the way, that one of the great tasks of philosophy is to unearth assumptions. I often point out to people that when you do this, when you look at the reasons why whole systems of beliefs are as they are, attitudes are as they are, you can be tremendously surprised by what you find as the originating impulse for that point of view. I'm speaking again as an Oxford person. You know, Oxford people always think that Cambridge people, because you've all heard of Oxford, you may have heard of the other place, that Cambridge people do think that what happens in Cambridge applies to the entire universe. Look at Isaac Newton, and he was hit on the head by a falling apple, made him look up and see the moon. He thought, why doesn't the moon fall to the earth? Began his thinking about the inverse square law of gravitation, which, like a good Cambridge man, he applied to the entire universe. Well, you might want to ask him why he did that. He would say, well, because the universe is the same everywhere. We now know, by the way, thanks to Einstein and so on, that it isn't. But he assumed that it was. And if you were to ask him why he thought that, he would say, because the universe was created by God, and God is an economical workman. Now, there are at least three huge assumptions there: that there is a God, that she created the universe, and that she's an economical workman. People ask me why I say she. I say to keep you awake. Well, these assumptions are independently debatable, but the really surprising thing about them is that they lie in the very foundations of classical Newtonian physics, and they are not physical or scientifically testable assumptions. And so many of the assumptions that lie behind what people think are like that. So digging out the assumptions of the other side's argument is a key to knowing how to address them, knowing how to put a case to them that might resonate.
Another question at the back there.
Your comments, all your comments, rest on the premise, which probably most of us here would share, that rational decisions are more likely to be the right decisions than non-rational decisions. Using the Popperian approach of falsifiability, is there any evidence to suggest that at all? In fact, I'll give you a piece of evidence we got earlier today, that research has been done into the decisions of groups of homogeneous, intelligent people and non-homogeneous, but perhaps lower IQ people. And the latter, apparently, I was unaware of this research, but we were told it this morning, consistently gave better decisions. Now, we'd all like to believe that I think we would all like to believe rational decisions are going to be the right ones. What evidence is that's the case?
Well, my immediate response to what you've just described about that piece of research is skepticism. So I should like to make an examination of the grounds. But there is an analogous point, which is a well understood point, and that is that sometimes people make very good decisions on the basis of their responses or instincts or something, and that's identified as being a non-rational decision, when in fact it isn't. What it is, it's the long-term outcome of rational ways of thinking. When you become very experienced at something, quite knowledgeable, you've got a lot of information about it, you've worked in that field for a long time, you can make judgments very quickly and very accurately and very well on the basis of that accumulated outcome of having been rational. In fact, I go back to the point I made about the partnership between how we respond to things and how we feel about things. If our emotions have been matured, and if at certain critical points in the way that we think about things and how we formulate our attitudes to things, we have been rational, that is, we've really weighed up contrasting ways of thinking about them, the outcome is going to be that we become a certain sort of person, rather good at judging in certain ways about certain subject matters. That is sometimes thought of as somebody being instinctive or responding in a sub-thought way, whereas actually it's an outcome of this much longer process of making them the kind of person who does judge well.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to give it to Francois. He's got no mic. No? Okay, we're going to stop there. Sorry. Oh, there is one. Sorry.
Yes, you mentioned David Hume, who famously said, "It is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger," or something along those lines. One of our previous speakers said that people make all their decisions out of self-interest. So couldn't it be argued that it's perfectly rational for people to make those decisions on that basis?
Well, of course, that's a contentious matter, whether the driver in decision-making is always self-interest. There is a very beautiful argument put forward by William Hazlitt, whom you mentioned earlier, who started life as a philosopher, an argument that was picked up and made much use of by the late and much lamented Derek Parfit, to the following effect, that if you believe that the choices, decisions we make are self-interested ones, you have to take into account the fact that all our decisions relate to the future, even if the future is 1 second away or 1 minute away. And that because our future selves don't exist, our understanding of what our own personal interest is has to be the same as the kind of understanding that we have of other people's interests, because our own future selves are other people. And therefore, the very idea of making judgments about the interest and welfare of any human individual involves the capacity to be able to do it for others. And the social nature of human beings powerfully reinforces the idea that we can have interests in and sympathies for the welfare and the future and the prospects of other people, which, if we didn't have them, we wouldn't be able to parlay into our thinking about our own future interests. This is sometimes referred to as the natural disinterestedness of the bases of moral action, of ethical choice, which is that the very ability to imagine what certain consequences of certain kinds of actions might be for ourselves depends upon our being able to think and apply those interests for others also. So this would suggest that the whole 18th century view, Hutcheson and Hume and other people, that self-interest is the great motivator, is that self-interest can only be part of the story. Well, that shuts you up, didn't it? Well, we'll prompt your appetite now for lunch, but I think it is lunchtime. And thank you so much for your attention.
It shut me up too, almost. So we come to the end of our conference.